The story of Corvette is dominated by many charismatic and highly visible figures. People like Harley Earl, Bill Mitchell, Ed Cole, and Zora Arkus Duntov made their mark in the automotive world in a big way. There were many, though, who played vital roles behind the scenes, working to make Corvette a world-class sports car. One such man was Henry Haga, our 2020 inductee into the Corvette Hall of Fame. Henry was born on January 22, 1931. As an only child growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he entertained himself by drawing cars. This love for art and the automobile would continue throughout his life, eventually leading him to Art Center College of Design and to General Motors.
And he was accepted to the Art Center School in Pasadena, California, which is Mecca for an automotive designer, or a car nut, or a combination of both. The American cars were a little on the large side, a little slow, poor handling, and they weren't the exciting cars that you'd like to be associated with. So Henry, being in California all those years at the Art Center School, really honed his skills on what was going on around the world and the appreciation of doing things differently than the way we were doing them here in the United States. He became an expert on where were the hot cars coming from, what was the technology that was making them so far superior to what we were doing. He brought that environment to the Chevy 2 studio, and I think it started to show up in our products from that moment on till we all started cranking out some pretty exciting vehicles for Chevrolet.
Henry was the chief of Chevy 2 and then the Chevy 3 studios from 1963 to 1973.
That was one of Bill Mitchell's most serious responsibilities, which was the Corvette. And so to have Hank there, give Hank that responsibility, really showed the admiration and the trust that he had for Hank. And he'd say to Hank, after he gave Hank the job of chief designer of Chevy 3, where the Corvette was designed, he'd say, "Boy, kid, I'd pay a lot of money to get a job like yours." And Hank would say, "I'm ready to pay," because he knew he had probably a job that every designer in the building envied.
When I learned that I was being transferred to Henry's studio, I really didn't know that much about Henry. And at the time, it was the Chevy 2 studio. Inside the second or third week, he said, "Hey, want to drive my car tonight?" I said, well, sure. "What is it?" It's a Corvette." I thought, wow. And I fell in love with Henry that moment, because he gave me my first Corvette experience in a contemporary car. It was fantastic. But Henry was so sharing. Whatever he had, you had. He was so easy to work with. It was a very, very creative atmosphere.
Henry Haga was an elegant man. I only knew him from a distance, but he invited, I was like just a young kid in the studio, and he invited me to his house with everybody else for a fantastic car event, and he was an absolute gentleman, they call it a real prince.
In the Corvette studio, I worked for a guy named Hank Haga. Hank Haga was the studio chief. He was the chief designer of the C3 Corvette. Just like Larry Shinoda and Hank and all the other Corvette chief designers, they were just easy to work for. Nobody's ever said as much, but I think they take the best people and put them in charge of their flagship car, which is the Corvette studio.
His job was to take the fantastic Mako Shark and Manta Ray concept Corvettes and tame them into production cars while preserving their excitement and energy.
So Hank had his own studio, and the first Camaro Hank did, and he worked on changes that were made to the '67 Corvette.
Henry Haga's first job as a studio head was to take the '67, where the car kind of got a little more cleaned up and tighter, and the finer vents on the side. That was out of Henry's studio.
When it came to the '68, it was the Manta that had been developed by Bill Mitchell and Larry Shinoda. Of course, Bill Mitchell would say he was the Corvette designer, and Hank did a great job. The '68 Corvette is arguably, people have a lot of opinions, but it's probably one of the best ever done, maybe the best ever done. My favorite is the convertible, you know, the car with the top down. It's spectacular.
Henry really did the number of capturing those previous show cars, the Mako Shark, the Manta Ray, capturing what they had, and in a production car, without losing the spirit of a special vehicle. Usually a special vehicle is so exciting, but to try to make it a real vehicle that you can get in and out of, it loses some of its magic. When that '68 Corvette came out, it had all the magic of those previous concept cars.
The C3 is a pretty nice car, pretty direct, pretty concise design. And Hank was a guy that was responsible for it. So that's a whole, and that car lasted a long time. Lasted longer than it should have, but with the updates and everything else, it was still a pretty nice car at the end, the '82.
Henry was an avid sports car enthusiast with a special love for Ferrari and Bugatti. Because of this, he would own those cars and take their inspiration to the design studio that worked on Corvette.
He had some great hobby cars and became one of the premier Ferrari enthusiasts in the greater Detroit area. And on how do you top a Ferrari? How about with a Type 35 Bugatti from 1927? He restored the car in his basement, which didn't look like a basement. It was just another creative environment for Henry.
He worked on the Bugatti for 24 years. It took 24 years to restore it, but he and his wife both participated. Ellie, his wife, was also a designer, and I think the two of them, with their design and art background, brought some real special qualifications to this restoration projects that they did. Ellie was a welder too. She did welding on the car. She did seats. She did the seats of the Bugatti. The leather jackets matched the seats. And Hank raced the car in a vintage event at the Detroit Grand Prix once, and I saw him there and he was wearing the jacket. But just a spectacular car from a design, engineering standpoint. All the Bugatti people that love Bugattis know about Bugattis. They know about Hank and Ellie. Corvette people do also. Ferrari people do also.
Loved Ferraris, but also was on watch on those great Corvettes.
During Henry's time at Chevrolet, he was able to explore the possibilities of what Corvette could be in the future.
We were doing a proposal for the four-rotor Corvette, and Jerry Palmer was Hank's assistant at the time. And Jerry did a proposal, and I did a proposal, and Hank looked at our proposals in quarter-scale clay, and he said, guys, those are futuristic cars, futuristic type Corvette cars, but that's not what the Bullet wants. And the Bullet was Bill Mitchell. He was known as the Bullet, never to his face, but he was the Bullet. And he said, Mitchell's never going to buy those cars. And he says, I think I'm gonna do a car of my own. And Hank, chief designer of the studio, he ordered a quarter-scale clay model and worked out a model, and he did his own version of this four-rotor Corvette. And man, he sold it. And it was exactly what Mitchell wanted.
I always liked the four-rotor car. If we could have productionized that, I think that would have been a magnificent accomplishment for all of us, because it's a seminal design. Everything about it is just, it has a perfection about it. I first saw it when Bill Mitchell drove it at Road America as a demonstration drive, and seeing it on the road, seeing it in that environment, it was an absolutely beautiful car. And it wasn't a Bugatti. They are special in their own right. And it wasn't a Ferrari. It would have been the next generation Corvette. And it could not have been a better concept design. The other car in that series that I got to know fairly well, that Henry was also involved with, was the mid-engine Reynolds Corvette, transverse V8 engine car that had an all-aluminum body, all-aluminum structure.
Perhaps his greatest contribution to Corvette was the way his management style cultivated creativity from those who worked under him.
So Henry's setting for his studio was one of fun, performance, design, design, design. There was no tension, absolutely zero tension in the studio. And you had the camaraderie of the whole management team, sculpting team, the engineers, the people coming over from Chevrolet Engineering. It was a great place to be.
Look back to like the 70s, and you look at the success of Corvette today, there's still this continuity, but it's not been a lot of people. It's only been a handful. You know, Jerry was mentored by Henry Haga, Randy, myself, Tom, a lot, you know, Tom to now, and then you got the new kids.
It's interesting, all the people that came up through that environment have all become leaders in GM design, and eventually ran the Corvette studio, and there's a little bit of Henry in all of us.
Hank should be in the Hall of Fame because of his involvement all those years, and especially as a chief designer of the C3 Corvette. Unfortunately, passed away early in life, and you know, it was like once he was gone, he was kind of forgotten.
He should be in there. There's that big block of Corvette history that's missing. You know, you kind of come up, you got Larry and Mitchell and but Henry Haga was the guy productionizing a lot of those cars.
Time creates legends. Time creates sometimes fictitious legends. But here's the real guy who really was in charge and did that C3 and did the 4-rotor, and he was involved in a lot of other projects too. And because he was gone early, sometimes he's overlooked.
Yeah, Henry Haga was a great guy.
And Henry's always been the guy that said, you gotta reach, you gotta try to break that chain and see what's possible. You'll never know what's possible unless you get that chain busted. So again, a lot of Henry and a lot of vehicles still around. Congratulations, Henry, you did it.
Henry would pass away in 1988 at the age of 57, but his influence lives on. For his love of America's sports car and the work he did to make it respected around the world, we welcome Henry Haga into the Corvette Hall of Fame.